In the golden age of the American television Western, the airwaves were filled with rugged men in dusty boots, but few possessed the quiet, smoldering intensity of Pernell Roberts. To the millions of families gathered around their television sets in the late 1950 seconds and early 60 seconds, he was Adam Cartwright, the eldest son of the Ponderosa, a man of intellect and steady moral fiber. He was the gentleman in the black hat, a figure of calm and charisma who seemed to anchor one of the most successful shows in the history of the medium. But beneath that smooth, mahogany-voiced exterior lived a man whose internal fire burned with a conviction that many in Hollywood found both baffling and deeply threatening. While his contemporaries were often content to smile for the cameras and bank their massive paychecks, Pernell Roberts was a man who believed that honesty mattered more than popularity, even if that honesty cost him his friends, his reputation, and his very livelihood. The legend of Pernell Roberts is often framed as the story of a man who simply walked away from a hit show. But the truth is far more complex and far more fascinating than a mere contract dispute. It is the story of a classically trained Shakespearean actor who found himself trapped in what he described as a comic strip world. A man of deep social conscience who couldn't stay silent while the industry he loved ignored the burning social issues of the day. At countless Hollywood gatherings and on the very sets that made him a household name, Roberts made it clear that there were certain titans of the industry he simply could not stand. These weren't petty rivalries or simple personality clashes. They were fundamental wars of the soul. He despised the arrogance, the hypocrisy, and the lack of integrity he saw in those who valued the status quo over human truth. Today, we are peeling back the layers of the Ponderosa to examine the 5 men who topped Pernell Roberts' secret list of those he held in contempt. From the golden boy of television to the man who played his own father on screen, these feuds were born from a heart that refused to compromise. We will explore why he called one legend a fraud, why he saw another as a man without a spine, and why he eventually chose to trade a $10,000 an episode salary for a seat on a bus to Selma, Alabama, to march alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is not just a chronicle of Hollywood gossip, but an investigation into the life of a man who demanded as much from the world as he did from himself, a man who believed that the bravest act anyone can perform is to simply walk away from a lie. Once you understand the reasons behind these bitter divides, you will never look at the legends of the Western era the same way again. Pernell Elvin Roberts, Jr. entered the world on the 18th of May, 1928, in the quiet, dusty town of Waycross, Georgia. Born into the heart of the Deep South during the height of the Great Depression, his early years were shaped by a world where life was anything but easy, and every cent was earned through hard, honest labor. He was the only child of Pernell Roberts Sr. and Minnie Myrtle Morgan Roberts. His father worked as a sales manager for Dr. Pepper, a role that required a certain grit and social navigation, while his mother was a devoted woman who fostered the boy's early curiosity and creative spark. Even as a young child in a rural setting where most boys were drawn to sports or local mischief, Pernell stood apart. He possessed an internal rhythm that didn't quite match the slow pace of Georgia life, finding his primary joy in the world of music and performance. He spent his youth playing the horn in the school band and performing for church gatherings, developing a stage presence long before he ever considered acting as a viable path for his future. Despite his natural flair for the spotlight, the young Pernell was a pragmatist at heart, or perhaps he was simply trying to fit into the expectations of a Southern man in the 1940 seconds. After graduating high school, he enrolled at Georgia Tech with the intention of pursuing a career in engineering. It was a field of blueprints, cold logic, and rigid equations, but it didn't take long for the young man to realize that his heart did not belong to the world of structures and mathematics. seeking a different kind of discipline, and perhaps a way to see the world beyond the borders of Georgia, he joined the United States Marine Corps in 1946. For 2 years, he served his country in uniform, yet even within the strict confines of military life, his artistic spirit refused to be extinguished. He found his solace in the Marine Corps band, where he played the tuba and the horn, keeping the flame of his musical passion alive amidst the drills and duties of service. When his enlistment ended, the man who returned to civilian life was no longer willing to settle for a practical career that left his soul empty. He took a leap of faith and enrolled at the University of Maryland, and it was here that the siren song of the stage finally became impossible to ignore. Immersing himself in student theater, Roberts discovered that acting was not merely a hobby or a way to pass the time. It felt like destiny. The connection he felt to the craft was visceral and deep, leading him to make the bold and risky choice to drop out of college and pursue a professional acting career full-time. By the early 1952, he had packed his meager belongings and headed for the concrete canyons of New York City, a place where a man's only currency was his talent and his sheer determination to survive. In New York, Roberts sharpened his tools at the prestigious American Academy of Dramatic Arts. To keep a roof over his head, he juggled a series of grueling odd jobs, refusing to let the hardships of the city break his resolve. His patience and persistence were finally rewarded in 1952 when he landed his first professional stage role in The Man Who Came to Dinner. While the part was small, it was the first real step on a path defined by a stubborn refusal to follow anyone's script but his own. He threw himself into the theater with a religious fervor, quickly gaining a reputation for a commanding voice and a magnetic presence that could silence even the most restless New York audience. He didn't just want to be an actor, he wanted to be an artist. This led him to the Shakespeare Festival, where he tackled the most demanding roles in the English language, including Macbeth, Romeo, and Petruchio in The Taming of the Shrew. By the late 1952, the prestige he had earned on the New York stage began to resonate in the halls of Hollywood. He made a stunning film debut in 1958 Inches Desire Under the Elms, standing toe-to-toe with legends like Sophia Loren and Burl Ives, proving that his intensity was not limited to the stage. He followed this with a role in the western The Sheepman and guest spots on legendary television shows like Gunsmoke and The Virginian. When NBC began casting for a new kind of western called Bonanza in 1959, they saw in Roberts the perfect embodiment of Adam Cartwright, intelligent, steadfast, and deeply principled. The show became a cultural phenomenon, transforming Roberts into a global superstar almost overnight. Yet, even as he walked the halls of the Ponderosa, the classically trained actor felt a growing, uneasy disconnect. He was a man who had been forged by Shakespeare and the Marines, and he was beginning to realize that the gilded cage of television stardom was becoming a prison for his convictions. By 1959, the television landscape was dominated by sprawling westerns, but NBC's Bonanza promised something different, a saga centered on the emotional bonds of a family rather than just lawless gunfights. When Pernell Roberts was cast as Adam Cartwright, he brought a level of gravitas and intellectual weight that helped the show explode into one of the greatest successes in the history of the medium. To the public, he was the brilliant eldest son, the moral compass of the Ponderosa, who balanced the impulsiveness of his younger brothers with quiet strength. However, for Roberts, the massive popularity of the series was a double-edged sword. While the world tuned in by the millions to watch the Cartwrights, Roberts felt an increasing, agonizing disconnect between the fame he was garnering and the artistic integrity he craved. He was a man trained in the depth of Shakespearean tragedy, yet he found himself delivering lines that he felt lacked any real human truth or social meaning. The friction between Roberts and the show's producers was not a secret kept for long behind closed doors. He became known as a man who was both deeply respected for his talent and feared for his willingness to speak his mind. Roberts was frequently frustrated by what he categorized as shallow writing, often clashing with the creative team over the repetitive and simplistic nature of the scripts. To him, the show was a gilded cage. It provided wealth and adoration, but offered zero artistic challenge. He saw the Ponderosa not as a frontier of storytelling, but as a factory line producing comfort food for the masses, avoiding the complex moral dilemmas that define the true human experience. While the network wanted to maintain a status quo that appealed to the broadest possible audience, Roberts was pushing for stories that had social relevance and moral complexity. His advocacy went beyond the quality of the prose. It was deeply rooted in his personal ethics and his vision for a more inclusive industry. Long before social justice became a common talking point in Hollywood, Pernell Roberts used his platform to challenge the systemic issues he saw on set. He was vocal in his opposition to the lack of sensitivity toward Native American characters, a common trope in Westerns that he found increasingly offensive. He questioned why white actors were repeatedly cast in roles meant for people of color, and why the production crew lacked diversity. His protests often fell on deaf ears at the network, which preferred the moral simplicity and conservative vision of the era over Roberts' demand for progress. For a man who would eventually march in Selma alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the silence and complacency of the television industry felt like a betrayal of his values. As the seasons progressed, the financial rewards of the show became astronomical. By the mid-1960 seconds, Roberts was one of the highest-paid actors in television, earning nearly $10,000 per episode, a fortune at the time. Yet, the money held little appeal for him. He felt a quiet restlessness that no paycheck could extinguish, a longing to live with purpose rather than just fame. He loathed how art was being reduced to a mere product, repackaged for mass consumption without regard for authenticity. To stay on the show was to accept a life of comfortable compromise, and for Pernell Roberts, that was a price he was no longer willing to pay. In 1965, at the absolute height of Bonanza's success, he made the decision that would shock the entertainment world. He walked away from the Ponderosa, choosing integrity over the applause of millions. When Pernell Roberts walked onto the set of the Ponderosa, he expected to find a brotherhood of artists. Instead, he found a corporate machine that he believed prioritized ego and safety over truth. This friction manifested most intensely in his relationships with the two men who shared the most screen time with him, Michael Landon and Lorne Greene. To the outside world, they were the picture of family unity, but behind the scenes, Roberts saw them as symbols of the very Hollywood traits he despised. His conflict with Michael Landon, the show's youngest star, began with a polite and even friendly dynamic, but it soured as Landon's influence within the production grew. Roberts viewed Landon as a man consumed by a dangerous cocktail of ambition and self-centeredness. As Landon began to write and direct episodes, Roberts observed a pattern that infuriated his sense of artistic justice. Landon would frequently rewrite scenes to ensure his character, Little Joe, was the emotional center or the hero of the story, often at the direct expense of the other actor's depth. The tension reached a boiling point when Roberts, never one to mince words, reportedly confronted Landon in front of the crew. He told Landon directly that he wasn't trying to make the show better, but was simply trying to make himself bigger. For a classically trained actor who believed the play was the thing, this perceived vanity was unforgivable. Roberts despised what he termed Landon's perfectionist image, believing that Landon was a performer who merely pretended to be deep on screen, while avoiding any authentic intellectual or emotional weight in his actual life. When Roberts finally made the choice to leave the series, the total silence from Landon The complete lack of acknowledgement for Roberts' contributions was the final insult that cemented their mutual coldness. Even years later, when Landon moved on to Little House on the Prairie, Roberts couldn't help but offer a biting critique, suggesting that Landon was still playing the saint and playing cowboy, a remark that revealed how little his opinion of the man had changed over the decades. If Landon represented the unchecked ambition Roberts feared, Lorne Greene represented the complacency he loathed. To millions, Greene was America's favorite father figure, Ben Cartwright, but to Roberts, he was the primary obstacle to the show's evolution. Roberts felt a stifling sense of control coming from Greene, both in front of the camera and behind it. He deeply resented how content Greene seemed with the show's moral simplicity and tidy endings. While Roberts was desperate to push Bonanza toward moral complexity and human truth, he saw Greene as someone who remained fiercely loyal to the network's conservative, safe vision just to maintain his comfortable position. To Roberts, this wasn't just being a company man, it was a surrender of artistic courage. The air between the on-screen father and son grew colder with every passing season. Roberts believed that Greene eventually came to see him as a threat, a younger, volatile intellectual who wasn't afraid to challenge the scripts or question the director's vision. Roberts specifically hated the authoritative atmosphere Greene maintained over the rest of the cast. He felt that the younger actors followed Greene without question, creating a hierarchy that Roberts found intellectually insulting. When he finally walked away from the massive paychecks in 1965, he did so largely because he could no longer stand the subservient role the show demanded. His famous explanation for leaving was perfectly in character. He simply couldn't spend the rest of his life taking his hat off and saying, "Yes, Pa." In Roberts' eyes, Greene had chosen the comfort of the status quo over the risk of being real, a choice that Roberts could never respect. While the friction with Landon and Greene was born of daily proximity, Pernell Roberts' other feuds were rooted in a deeper, more fundamental clash of worldviews. The most heartbreaking of these was his fallout with Dan Blocker, the man who played the gentle Hoss Cartwright. This was not a feud born of malice, but of profound disappointment. In the early years of the show, Roberts and Blocker were incredibly close. Both were classically trained actors who shared a passion for bringing authenticity to their roles. However, as Roberts' battles with the network intensified, he felt Blocker began to retreat into a role of neutrality. To Roberts, neutrality in the face of what he saw as shallow writing and the show's lack of sensitivity toward Native American characters was a form of cowardice. Roberts took it deeply personally when Blocker acted as a peacemaker, smoothing things over with producers rather than standing shoulder to shoulder with him in protest. The tension reached a breaking point when Roberts walked off the set mid-scene after being handed what he called a degrading script. When Blocker continued to film the scene without him, the rift became permanent. Roberts later remarked with biting sorrow that while Dan had the heart, he lacked the spine, choosing the comfort of his paycheck over the conscience of his craft. Beyond the Ponderosa, Roberts' ideological war extended to other icons of the Western genre, most notably Chuck Connors and James Drury. His hatred for Connors, the star of The Rifleman, began at a charity event where Roberts witnessed Connors publicly berating a young assistant over a minor mistake. For a man who valued humility and respect, this display of arrogance was unforgivable. Backstage, the two legends clashed violently. Roberts called Connors a fraud who cared only for fame, while Connors mocked Roberts as a bitter quitter. Roberts would later refer to Connors as being all hat, no soul, a man who was empty beneath his televised charm. However, the most intellectual of his feuds was with James Drury, the stoic star of The Virginian. This was a pure clash of political and social values. Roberts was a vocal activist who spoke out against racism and the Vietnam War, while Drury was a staunch conservative who believed politics had no place in the world of entertainment. During a televised panel in the 1970 seconds, the two came to blows over the purpose of the television Western. Roberts criticized the genre for being comfort food that avoided real-world issues, while Drury argued that the public simply wanted escape. Roberts walked away from the encounter believing Drury was a mouthpiece for the status quo. Most damningly, Roberts could never forgive Drury's silence during the civil rights movement, viewing that silence not as neutrality, but as a betrayal of humanity. When Pernell Roberts walked away from the Ponderosa in 1965, he didn't just leave a television set. He stepped into a self-imposed exile from the Hollywood machine. To the industry elite, his departure was an act of professional suicide, but for Roberts, it was a necessary liberation. He spent the following years returning to his true love, the theater. He toured the country in stage productions, relishing the raw, immediate connection with an audience that a television camera could never replicate. During this period, he wasn't just acting, he was living out his convictions. In an era where many stars feared for their careers, Roberts put his body on the line, marching in Selma, Alabama, alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Roberts marched as a private citizen, driven by an unyielding desire for authenticity and justice that far outweighed his desire for a Hollywood star. Despite being unofficially blacklisted by some producers who viewed him as difficult, Roberts' talent was too immense to be ignored forever. By the late 1970 seconds, he orchestrated one of the most successful second acts in television history. He landed the lead role in Trapper John M.D., a spin-off of MASH*. This role allowed him to portray a character with the depth and moral complexity he had long craved, eventually earning him critical acclaim and a new generation of fans. However, even as professional success returned, his personal life remained a turbulent sea of quiet sorrow. He was a man who craved freedom but found emotional intimacy difficult, leading to 3 divorces that left him often isolated. He built high emotional walls, perhaps as a defense mechanism against an industry he felt had repeatedly tried to hollow him out. The most crushing blow to his guarded heart came in 1989. His only son, Jonathan Christopher Roberts, was killed in a tragic motorcycle accident at the age of 38. Friends observed that Roberts was never truly the same after this loss. The man who had spent his life fighting for grand ideals was suddenly faced with a personal grief that no amount of conviction could resolve. He retreated further into a private life in Malibu, shunning the spotlight and fan conventions, preferring the company of his 4th wife, Eleanor Criswell, and his music. He faced his final battle, pancreatic cancer, with the same quiet dignity and lack of complaint that defined his career. When he passed away on the 24th of January 2010, at the age of 81, he was the last surviving member of the original Bonanza cast. A final ironic twist for the man who had been the first to leave. Pernell Roberts lived his life on his own terms, fearless, outspoken, and entirely unyielding. While many in the industry measured success by the length of a contract or the volume of applause, Roberts measured it by the weight of his integrity. He was a pioneer who walked away from a massive hit show when it failed to meet his artistic and moral standards, a move that remains one of the most daring acts in television history. Long before it was fashionable or safe for a leading man to do so, he spoke out on social and racial issues, demanding meaningful roles and honest representation not just for himself, but for all performers. He was a man who marched in Selma not for the cameras, but because his conscience left him no other choice. At the time of his death in 2010, Roberts left behind more than just memories. He left an estimated fortune of $10 million, proving that a man could maintain his principles and still thrive. Yet, for Pernell, the money was never the point. He loathed how art was often reduced to a product, and how authenticity was repackaged for mass consumption. Fans remember him not only as the intelligent and steadfast Adam Cartwright, but as a man of fierce conviction who chose a life of purpose over the hollow glamour of celebrity. He was the last surviving member of the original Bonanza cast, outliving the very institution he once fought so hard to change. The legacy of Pernell Roberts serves as a powerful reminder that the bravest act one can perform is to walk away from a situation that demands the sacrifice of one's soul. His voice, both on-screen and off, continues to resonate with those who admire true talent and respect unwavering principles. He was a man of the stars who never lost sight of the earth beneath his feet, a rebel whose greatest cause was the truth.